The date is June 9, 1982. The location is the Bekaa Valley, a narrow, fertile strip of land in eastern Lebanon, sandwiched between the towering ridges of Mount Lebanon and the anti-Lebanon mountains. To the naked eye, it is a picturesque landscape of vineyards and ancient ruins. But to the electronic eye of a radar operator, this valley is a fortress of steel and fire. It is, at this precise moment in history, one of the most dangerous places on Earth to fly an airplane. Inside the stifling, cigarette smoke-filled command vans of the Syrian Air Defense Force, the mood is not one of fear, it is one of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. And why shouldn't it be? They are protected by the absolute pinnacle of Soviet military engineering. Over the last year, with the direct assistance of advisors from Moscow, the Syrian military has constructed a dense, interlocking missile umbrella throughout the valley. This is not a ragtag collection of old guns. This is a state-of-the-art, integrated air defense network. It is built around the terrified legends of the Vietnam War and the Yom Kippur War. The stars of the show are the SA-6 gainful mobile surface-to-air missile systems. These are the weapons that shocked the world in 1973, tearing through the Israeli Air Force and shattering the myth of Western air superiority. Alongside the lethal SA-6 batteries, there are the SA-2 seconds and SA-3 seconds, massive, telephone pole-sized missiles designed to swat high-altitude bombers out of the stratosphere. And covering the low ground, there are hundreds of ZSU-234 Shilka anti-aircraft tanks capable of spewing 4,000 rounds per minute of high-explosive fury. From the perspective of the Soviet generals watching from afar and their advisors embedded within the Syrian command structure, this network is unbreakable. It is a mathematical equation of overlapping kill zones that no Western aircraft can survive. They believe they have created a no-fly zone that is impenetrable by the laws of physics as they understand them. The Soviet doctrine is clear. Volume overcomes precision. If the enemy flies into the valley, the radar network will lock onto them, the tracking computers will calculate the intercept, and the sky will turn into a wall of fire. But at 1400 hours on that sweltering June afternoon, the laws of physics seem to change. It begins not with an explosion, but with a pulse, a ghost. Deep inside the command vehicle of a primary SA-6 battery, the senior radar officer is staring at his scope. The rotating green sweep of the straight flush radar is hypnotic. For weeks, they have been waiting for the Israeli Air Force to make a mistake. They are begging for a fight. Suddenly, the scope lights up. A blip appears, then another, then 10, then 20. The officer shouts the contact. The pristine silence of the command van shatters. The blips are moving slowly, lazily, drifting into the heart of the kill zone. To the Soviet-trained operators, this makes no sense. Israeli pilots are known for their aggression, their speed, their low-level maneuvering. These targets are behaving like sleepwalkers. They are flying high, slow, and straight. It looks like a suicide run. Confusion ripples through the chain of command. Is this a trap? Is it a glitch in the Soviet hardware? The radar signatures are solid. The computers confirm target acquired. Range 15 kilometers. Altitude 10,000 feet. The order is given. Fire. The ground shakes as the solid fuel rocket motors ignite. 3 massive missiles roar off their launch rails, trailing thick plumes of white smoke, accelerating to Mach 2 in seconds. The operators watch the screens, waiting for the inevitable splash, the radar confirmation of a kill. But the splash never comes. The missiles track perfectly, their guidance fins adjusting, closing the distance. And then, at the last possible second, the targets vanish. Not destroyed, just gone. The missiles fly harmlessly into empty air, self-detonating their warheads against nothing but clouds. Before the crews can process this anomaly, the radar scope fills up again. More targets, dozens of them. They are everywhere. To the north, the south, directly overhead. The straight flush tracking radars begin to swing wildly, their servos whining as they try to lock onto a swarm of enemies that seem to be materializing out of thin air. Panic begins to set in. The Soviet advisors are barking questions that the Syrian operators cannot answer. What is the target type? Are they Phantom jets? Are they Skyhawks? Unknown, the signature is fluctuating. Then, the true nightmare begins. It starts as a low hum in the headsets of the communications officers, a background static that quickly rises in pitch. Within seconds, the hum becomes a scream. Every radio frequency used by the Syrian defense network is suddenly flooded with noise. It isn't just static, it is a chaotic, layered wall of electronic interference. Some operators report hearing strange, high-pitched squeals, others hear what sounds like distorted music. The crucial data links between the search radars and the fire control units are severed. The command centers can no longer talk to the missile batteries. The integrated network is instantly disintegrated. It is no longer a shield. It is a collection of blind, deaf men standing in a dark room. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of military history and understanding how the Cold War shaped the modern world, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We break down the classified files and the forgotten battles that changed history. Back in the Bekaa Valley, the confusion turns into terror. The radar screens, once clear and precise, are now awash in snow. The green sweep is obliterated by white noise. The Soviet-built P-15 and P-12 radars, the eyes of the entire operation, are effectively blind. They are being jammed with a power and sophistication that the Soviet manuals said was impossible. The operators try to switch to backup frequencies. Jammed. They try to use optical sights, peering out of the hatches into the bright sunlight. But the sky is empty. There are no attacking formations of F-4 Phantoms or F-15 Eagles darkening the Sunday. "Where are they?" a commander screams. "We have 50 targets on the scope, but the sky is clear." And then, the first battery dies. There is no warning, no screech of an incoming jet engine, just a sudden, thunderous impact. A radar van, located 3 kilometers to the north, simply evaporates in a ball of flame. Then another, and another. The reports start flooding in via hardline field telephones, the only communication still working. "Battery 4 is hit! Battery 9 is down! We are under attack. We cannot see them." The men inside the remaining vans are paralyzed. They are being hunted by an invisible predator. They are looking at their screens, desperate to find a target to shoot back at, but all they see are ghosts, phantom signals that dance and weave, mocking their technology. When they try to lock on, their cursors slide off the screen. When they fire their missiles in desperation, the rockets spin out of control, their guidance links severed by the invisible electronic wall. For the Soviet advisors, this is a moment of profound psychological shock. They are watching their most advanced export technology, the very same equipment that defends Moscow and the Warsaw Pact nations, being dismantled piece by piece. And they don't know how. Is it a new American stealth weapon? Is it a laser? Is it sabotage? The paranoia spikes. The unbeatable SA-6, the weapon that terrified NATO for a decade, is acting like a toy. Its radar beams are being sucked into a void. The operators are fighting a war against electrons, and they are losing. Then, the final humiliation. Through the electronic haze, the radar operators finally catch a glimpse of something real. The jamming lifts for a split second, just long enough for the long-range search radars to paint a terrifying picture. A massive wave of aircraft is crossing the coast. Not ghosts this time, real metal. The Syrian Air Force scrambles everything they have. MiG-21 and MiG-23 aircraft roar down the runways, climbing on afterburners to intercept the threat. The pilots are brave, trained in the Soviet style of ground-controlled interception. They are vectored toward the enemy. "Ground control, I have no contact," a Syrian pilot radios. "My radar is white. I cannot see. Vector 180, enemy is 10 kilometers. Engage." But the MiG pilots are flying blind, just like the missile batteries below. Their onboard radars are flooded with the same screaming interference. They are dependent on ground controllers who are staring at snow-filled screens. From the ground, the soldiers watch as the MiG-21 aircraft dive into the fight. They expect a dogfight. They expect the chaotic ballet of aerial combat. Instead, they witness a slaughter. One by one, the MiG aircraft begin to fall from the sky. They are exploding without ever firing a shot. There are no dogfights. There are just fireballs. The Syrian planes are being picked off by missiles fired from beyond visual range, by enemies they cannot see, cannot track, and cannot kill. In the span of 2 hours, the impenetrable fortress of the Bekaa Valley is reduced to a graveyard of smoking metal. 19 missile batteries are destroyed, 82 aircraft are shot down. The Israeli losses, 0. The smoke clears over the valley, revealing the twisted wreckage of the Soviet Union's reputation. The silence that follows is heavier than the noise of battle. But for the men in Moscow, staring at the preliminary reports in disbelief, The terror is just beginning. The destruction of the hardware is bad, but the mystery is worse. How did the enemy blind the radars? How did they make the missiles go inert? How did they shoot down 82 jets without a scratch? This wasn't just a defeat, it was an anomaly. It broke the rules of war. And if the Americans or their proxies possess a technology that can simply turn off Soviet air defenses, then the balance of power in the Cold War has just shifted fast enough to snap a neck. The Kremlin demands answers. A special commission is formed immediately. They need to know what happened in those 2 hours. They need to find the ghost in the machine, because if they don't, the motherland is defenseless. The hunt for the truth begins now. The smoke over the Baikal Valley had barely drifted away before the telex machines in Moscow began to chatter with the rhythm of a catastrophe. In the hallways of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, the initial reports were met not with anger, but with a terrifying silence. The data coming out of Damascus was simply not compatible with the Soviet worldview. To the generals who had spent their lives studying the mathematics of war, the report read like bad fiction. 19 batteries lost, 0 enemy kills. It was a statistical impossibility. The Soviet military doctrine was built on the concept of acceptable losses. You trade 3 missiles for 1 plane. You trade 10 tanks to break a line. But you do not trade an entire air defense network for nothing. Within 48 hours, a high-level Soviet military delegation touched down in Syria. Led by Colonel General Yevgeny Yurasov, the first deputy commander of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, their mission was officially described as a fact-finding trip. In reality, it was an autopsy. General Yurasov arrived with a team of radar specialists, electronic warfare engineers, and intelligence officers from the GRU. Their orders from the Kremlin were explicit. Find the weapon that did this. Find the traitor who allowed it. Or find the flaw in the physics. The scene on the ground was a humiliation. The investigators walked through the blackened skeletons of the SA-6 gainful launchers. These machines, usually treated with reverence as the guardians of the sky, were now twisted scrap metal, their electronics fused together by the heat of precision strikes. The investigation began with the interrogation of the surviving Syrian crews. The interviews were intense, fueled by a desperate need to blame human error rather than technological inferiority. "You must have turned the radars on too late," the Soviet engineers insisted. "You must have neglected the frequency hopping protocols." But the Syrian accounts were consistent, and they were chilling. "We did exactly as the manual said," one battery commander reported, his face bandaged from burns. "We switched frequencies. We went to backup channels. But the jamming, it followed us. It was as if they knew which button I was going to press before I pressed it." This was the first clue, and it terrified the GRU officers. Frequency hopping was supposed to be the ultimate defense against jamming. It worked by randomly changing the radio frequency thousands of times a second. For the enemy to jam it, they would have to predict the random sequence. That was mathematically impossible unless the enemy had broken the code. Unless there was a mole. The paranoia set in immediately. The investigation turned inward. Had the Americans stolen the blueprints for the SA-6? Was there a spy in the design bureau in Moscow? The Soviet counterintelligence teams began tearing apart the personnel files of everyone who had ever worked on the gainful system. Meanwhile, the technical teams were trying to analyze the ghosts that had swamped the radar screens. They replayed the few magnetic tape recordings of the radar scopes that had survived the attack. They watched the playback in a darkened room in Damascus. They saw the green sweep of the radar. They saw the sudden eruption of hundreds of targets. "Look at the velocity," a technician pointed out, tracing the blips on the screen. "These targets, they are too slow to be fighters. But they have the radar cross-section of a heavy bomber." It didn't make sense. If they were bombers, why didn't they drop bombs? If they were fighters, why were they so slow? "Decoys," a general muttered. "They must be balloons, or gliders. But gliders do not emit electronic jamming signals," the engineer countered. "These ghosts were screaming on every frequency. A balloon cannot carry a heavy jamming pod. It requires a generator. It requires an engine." The theory of the impossible aircraft began to take root. The Soviets started to suspect that the Americans had developed a new class of weapon, something small, unmanned, yet capable of carrying heavy electronic warfare gear. But the technology required to miniaturize a jamming suite into a drone that small? That was science fiction. The Soviet equivalent equipment weighed hundreds of kilograms and required a large truck to carry. The investigation deepened, and the theories became more desperate. One faction of the investigation team became convinced that the Israelis had used a new type of television-guided weapon that didn't rely on radar at all. They scoured the wreckage for optical sensors. They found debris, fragments of metal with English stenciling, but nothing that explained the total blindness of the radar network. Another theory was even more disturbing, the E-2C Hawkeye myth. The Soviets knew the Israelis were flying the American-made E-2C Hawkeye, a radar plane with a giant rotating dish on its back. They knew it was an airborne command post. But the reports from the Bekaa Valley suggested the Hawkeye was doing something godlike. "They are seeing us before we turn our radars on," a GRU analyst concluded in a classified memo. "They are triangulating our position from the passive electronic emissions of our radios. They know where we are just by listening to our heartbeat." This was the bogeyman. The idea that the enemy could see you, track you, and target you without ever emitting a signal of their own. It meant that the very act of turning on a search radar, the first step in Soviet air defense doctrine, was now a suicide note. As the weeks passed, the investigation yielded a grim picture, but no smoking gun. They couldn't find a piece of a crashed alien spacecraft. They couldn't find a single defector who had given away the codes. Instead, they found a pattern of systemic failure. The MiG-21 and MiG-23 aircraft that had been shot down offered the grimest evidence. The wreckage of the jets showed that many had been hit from the side or the rear. The pilots never saw the missile coming. Their radar warning receivers, RWR, the device that beeps when an enemy radar locks onto you, had remained silent. "The Americans have changed the frequencies of their missiles," the report stated. "Our warning systems are looking for the wrong band. We are deaf." The conclusion that was slowly, painfully forming in the minds of the Soviet generals was not that they had been outfought, it was that they had been outthought. The enemy wasn't just using better planes, they were fighting a different kind of war. A war of electrons, of data, of real-time integration. But the Kremlin leadership, aging and rigid, refused to accept this intellectual defeat. It was easier to believe in a specific, secret superweapon that could be stolen or copied, rather than admitting their entire military philosophy was obsolete. "Find the weapon," the order came down again. "Find the gadget that makes the drones look like bombers. Find the jammer that breaks our codes." They were looking for a magic trick. They didn't realize they were looking at the future of warfare. While the Soviets chased shadows in the desert, scouring the sand for microchips and blaming their Syrian allies for incompetence, the true answer was sitting on a runway hundreds of miles away. It wasn't magic. It was a machine so strange, so ungainly, and so deceptively simple that the Soviet mind, obsessed with size, speed, and armor, could not comprehend its power. They were looking for a dragon. They should have been looking for a toy. While Colonel General Urasov and his team were kicking through the scorched sand of the Bekaa Valley, hunting for alien technology or superweapons, the ghosts they feared were sitting quietly in a hangar less than 200 kilometers away. They were not, as the Soviets suspected, hypersonic stealth bombers. They were not invisible spacecraft. They were glorified model airplanes. To understand the catastrophe that befell the Soviet air defense network, we have to look away from the brute force of the Iron Curtain and step into the sun-drenched innovation hubs of the West, specifically the fusion of American aerospace engineering and Israeli tactical desperation. For decades, the Cold War had been defined by a simple contest: higher, faster, stronger. The Soviets built bigger missiles, the Americans built faster jets. It was a heavyweight boxing match. But by the late 1970s, the United States had quietly changed the game. They stopped trying to just punch harder. They started trying to think faster. The source of the humiliation in Lebanon was not a single weapon, it was a system. A deadly choreography of 3 specific American technologies that, when combined, created a trap the Soviet doctrine was incapable of understanding. First, there was the ghost. In the West, they were called remotely piloted vehicles, or RPVs. Today, we know them as drones. In 1982, the Soviet military regarded them as toys training targets for anti-aircraft gunners to practice on. They were small, made of fiberglass, and powered by loud, whining piston engines that sounded like lawnmowers. But the Israelis, using American concepts, had turned these toys into the ultimate bait. The aircraft in question were the Scout and the Mastiff. They were tiny, slow, and unarmed, but they carried a secret payload, a Lundberg lens. This was a simple geometric radar reflector attached to the side of the drone. It did something physically counterintuitive. It took the radar wave from a Soviet tracking station and magnified it, bouncing it back with the intensity of a much larger object. On the scope of a Soviet operator, this tiny fiberglass plane didn't look like a toy. It looked like a fighter jet. It looked like an F-4 Phantom laden with bombs. This was the solution to the impossible event in Part 1. The swarm of targets that appeared on the Syrian screens were not hallucinations. They were cheap, expendable drones, buzzing into the valley to ask a very loud question: who wants to shoot me? The moment the Syrian operators took the bait, the moment they flipped the switch on their straight-flush radars to lock onto these bombers, they signed their own death warrants. Because high above the valley, waiting in the stratosphere, was the second piece of the puzzle. The eye. Circling safely over the Mediterranean Sea was the Grumman E-2C Hawkeye. Built by the United States Navy to protect carrier battle groups from Soviet bombers, the Hawkeye was the most advanced airborne radar system on the planet. To the casual observer, it looked ridiculous, a twin-propeller cargo plane with a massive 24-foot rotating saucer strapped to its back. But inside that fuselage was the first true computer of the modern battlefield. The E-2C could track hundreds of targets simultaneously. More importantly, it could sniff the electronic spectrum. As the Syrian radars lit up to track the drones, the Hawkeyes saw them instantly. They didn't just see the location, they identified the specific fingerprint of the radar pulse. They knew which battery was an SA-6, which was an SA-2, and which was a ZSU-234 anti-aircraft tank. The E-2C took this chaotic flood of data and organized it into a pristine digital map of the battlefield. The Soviet doctrine relied on voice commands over static-filled radios, a slow, analog process. The American-built system relied on data links. The Hawkeye was a server room in the sky, beaming target coordinates directly to the cockpits of the waiting fighter jets. This was the ingenuity that the Soviets could not replicate. The Soviets had better missiles. They had faster interceptors, but the Americans had information dominance. And then came the claw. Once the drones had provoked the radars, and the Hawkeye had mapped them, the executioners arrived. These were the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle and the General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon. These jets were the physical embodiment of American Cold War dominance. The F-15 was a twin-engine monster, designed with one purpose: to clear the sky of anything that flew. The F-16 was a nimble, fly-by-wire predator, capable of pulling 9 Gs in a turn, maneuvering in ways that would cause a Soviet MiG pilot to black out. But it wasn't just the planes, it was what they carried. Slung under their wings were the AGM-78 Standard Arm and the AGM-45 Shrike. These were anti-radiation missiles. They were vampires. They didn't need to see the target with a camera. They simply hunted the radar beam itself. When a Syrian operator locked onto a drone, his radar dish emitted a focused cone of energy. The American missiles picked up that energy and rode it all the way down to the source. The radar beam became a guideline for its own destruction. The genius of the American trap was that it turned the Soviet strength into a weakness. The straight-flush radar was powerful and precise, but the more power it pumped out to burn through the jamming, the brighter it shone for the incoming missiles. The Syrians were in a double bind, a psychological trap from which there is no escape. If they turned their radars off, they were blind, and the Israeli bombers would destroy them with conventional bombs. If they turned their radars on, they lit a beacon for the anti-radiation missiles, and they died in a ball of fire. It was a checkmate before the first pawn had even moved. The mystery of the jamming that the Soviets found so terrifying was also revealed here. The Israelis were using American-made ALQ-119 jamming pods, but they were using them with a new level of precision. Instead of just blasting noise across all frequencies, barrage jamming, they used the data from the Hawkeyes to conduct spot jamming. They targeted the specific communication frequencies used by the MiG pilots. This explained the confusion of the Soviet investigation. The reason the MiG-21 pilots were deaf and blind was that the enemy knew their radio frequencies better than they did. The American tech allowed the Israelis to listen to the Soviet ground controllers, isolate the frequency, and blast it with white noise. The impossible was simply the result of integration. The Soviet military was a collection of strong individual limbs, a strong radar arm, a strong missile leg, a strong fighter fist. But they were not connected to a central brain. The American system, utilized by the Israelis, was a single nervous system. The drone was the fingertip that felt the heat. The Hawkeye was the brain that processed the signal. The F-15 was the muscle that reacted. The reaction time was 0. While the Soviet general staff was still waiting for a phone call to confirm a sighting, the American-made missile was already detonating inside the radar van. This was the secret that was hidden in plain sight. It wasn't a laser, it wasn't magic, it was the microchip. It was the realization that in the late 20th century, information was more lethal than explosives. But the Soviets, blinded by their own dogma, could not see this. They were about to receive the final confirmation of their obsolescence in the most painful way possible. The investigation was about to end, not with a report, but with a shock that would rattle the windows of the Kremlin itself. The trap had been sprung. Now, it was time for the reveal. The true horror for the Soviet Union did not come from the initial reports of destroyed missile batteries. Machines can be replaced. Radars can be rebuilt. The true horror came 48 hours later, when they played their ace card and watched it burn. The reveal of the American dominance wasn't a document or a speech. It was a specific, brutal event that took place in the skies above Lebanon on June 11, 1982. Up until this moment, the Soviet generals in Moscow could comfort themselves with excuses. They told themselves the SA-6 batteries were stationary targets, commanded by panicked Syrian conscripts. They told themselves the surprise attack was a cheap shot by the Israelis. But in the air, the generals argued, it will be different. Our aircraft are superior, our pilots are disciplined. When we send in the heavy iron, the Americans will run. The heavy iron was the MiG-25 Foxbat. To understand the weight of this moment, you must understand the legend of the Foxbat. For 15 years, this aircraft had been the bogeyman of the Western world. It was a monster of stainless steel and titanium, powered by two massive Tumansky turbojets that were essentially rockets. It could fly at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound. It could fly at 80,000 feet, higher than any Western fighter could reach. In the 1970s, MiG-25 aircraft had flown over Israel with impunity. The Israelis had fired missiles at them, and the Foxbats had simply outrun the explosions. It was the pride of the Soviet military-industrial complex. It was the unbeatable king of the sky. So, as the ground war raged on, the Syrian Air Force, desperate to stop the bleeding, unleashed the Foxbats. The order came down, sweep the sky. 4 MiG-25 interceptors roared off the runway at Tias Air Base. They climbed rapidly, their afterburners glowing white-hot, ascending to the stratosphere where they were kings. Their mission was to drop from the heavens on top of the Israeli F-15 Eagles and crush them with sheer speed and power. On the ground, the Soviet advisors watched the radar screens with grim satisfaction. This was the counterstroke. The American F-15s were flying lower, around 20,000 feet. The Foxbats were at 40,000 and climbing. In traditional air combat physics, the plane with the altitude and speed advantage always wins. It is simple energy management. But as the MiG-25 aircraft reached their attack position, the shock arrived. It happened in silence. The lead Syrian pilot, confident in his invincibility, looked at his radar scope to lock onto the enemy below. He expected to see the clear, burning blips of the F-15s. He saw nothing. His radar, the massive Smerch A, was a powerful beast, but it had a fatal flaw that the Americans had exploited. It utilized older pulse radar technology. When the Foxbat looked down towards the Earth, the radar waves bounced off the ground, the mountains, the buildings, the cars, and created a blinding clutter on the screen. The F-15s, flying against the backdrop of the terrain, were invisible. They were hidden in the ground clutter. The Soviet pilot was flying the fastest, most powerful interceptor in the world, but he was looking into a kaleidoscope of noise. "I have no target," he screamed into his mask. "I cannot see them against the ground." Meanwhile, 10 miles below, inside the cockpits of the Israeli F-15 Eagles, the situation was the exact opposite. And this was the moment the Cold War balance of power officially snapped. The F-15s were equipped with the Hughes APG-63 radar. It used a revolutionary technology called pulse Doppler. Unlike the Soviet radar, the American computer could filter out the ground. It ignored anything that wasn't moving at the speed of a jet. To the American-built radar, the ground was black. The only thing that lit up was the MiG-25 aircraft descending from above. The Israeli pilots watched the invincible Foxbats on their screens with almost clinical detachment. They didn't need to climb, they didn't need to engage in a dogfight, they simply waited. The foxbats were blind giants, swinging a sledgehammer in a dark room. The eagles were snipers with night vision goggles. At a range of 20 miles, well beyond visual contact, the Israelis fired. The AIM-7 Sparrow missiles ignited, streaking upward. The Soviet advisors on the ground saw the tragedy unfold on their long-range search radars. They saw the F-15s fire. They saw the missiles track. And they shouted into their microphones, brake left, missile launch!" But the MiG-25 pilots, deafened by the same electronic jamming that had blinded the ground batteries, heard nothing but static. The impact was catastrophic. The first MiG-25 disintegrated. The titanium wonder was torn apart not by a superior aircraft, but by a superior microchip. The remaining Foxbats panicked. They tried to use their legendary speed to escape, pushing their throttles to the firewall. But you cannot outrun a missile that has already locked onto you from the front. Within minutes, the pride of the Soviet Air Force was burning on the rocks of the Lebanese mountains. The reveal hit Moscow like a physical blow. The report that landed on the desk of Marshal Nikolai Ogakov, the chief of the General Staff, was devastating. It wasn't just that they had lost planes, it was how they had lost them. The report detailed a complete technological eclipse. The American radars could see down, the Soviet radars could only see up. The American missiles could track through jamming, the Soviet missiles went stupid. The American data links allowed them to coordinate traps, the Soviet voice radios were jammed into silence. This was the moment of shock. For decades, the Soviet Union had believed that quantity had a quality all its own. They believed that if they built enough tanks and enough jets, they could overwhelm the West. But in the skies over Lebanon, they realized that the era of brute force was over. The era of smart war had begun. A specific, classified anecdote from the investigation sums up this despair. A Soviet team examined the wreckage of an Israeli drone that had crashed due to engine failure. They cracked open the electronics bay, expecting to find crude, soldier-proof wiring. Instead, they found printed circuit boards. They found miniaturized processors. They found components that were years, perhaps a decade, ahead of the best military electronics produced in Leningrad. One Soviet engineer, holding a piece of American circuitry from a toy airplane, reportedly turned to his superior and said, "Comrade General, we do not have the schools to teach people how to build this. We do not even have the machines to make the machines that make this." The confrontation was over. The mystery was solved. The ghosts were simply superior technology. The response from the Soviet leadership was a mixture of denial and panic. They immediately ordered the shipment of updated weapons to Syria, the SA-8, Gecko and Beta MiG, 23 aircraft. It was a futile gesture. The pilots were terrified. The morale of the Syrian Air Force had collapsed. They knew that taking off meant flying into a technological buzzsaw. The unbeatable network was gone, wiped out in 2 hours, and the reinforcements were just fresh meat for the grinder. The Soviets tried to classify the results. They forbade the Syrian military from speaking to the press. They buried the reports in the deepest archives of the Kremlin. They tried to pretend that the Bekaa Valley Turkey shoot never happened. But the world saw, and more importantly, the Americans saw. The Pentagon had spent the last 10 years terrified of the Soviet military monster. They had feared the waves of tanks and the swarms of MiGs. But now, the curtain had been pulled back. The monster was old. It was blind. And it was vulnerable. The reveal was absolute. The Soviet Union was not a military superpower on par with the United States. It was a hollow giant, armed with yesterday's weapons, waiting to be dismantled. But the final tally, the numbers that would haunt military historians for generations, was yet to be written. The battle was over, but the legacy of those 2 hours was about to change the map of the world. The battle lasted only a few days, but the silence it left behind lasted for decades. When the final tally was calculated, the numbers were so lopsided that military analysts around the world initially refused to believe them. They assumed it was propaganda. They assumed the Israelis were hiding their losses to maintain morale. But the wreckage didn't lie. In the span of 48 hours, the Syrian military, armed, trained and advised by the Soviet Union, had fired roughly 1,000 surface-to-air missiles. They scored 0 hits. 82 MiG-21, MiG-23 and Su-22 aircraft had been blown out of the sky. 19 air defense batteries, the backbone of the Soviet umbrella, were smoking craters. The Israeli Air Force? They didn't lose a single fighter jet in air-to-air combat. They lost one, a 4 Skyhawk to ground fire, and 2 drones. This was not a victory. It was an erasure. The verdict was chilling. The exchange ratio was infinite. For the first time in the history of aerial warfare, one side had achieved total, absolute supremacy. For the Soviet generals sitting in the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, these numbers were more than just a defeat in a proxy war. They were a vision of their own apocalypse. For 30 years, the entire strategy of the Warsaw Pact had been built on the concept of air denial. They knew they couldn't build better jets than the Americans, so they built millions of tons of anti-aircraft missiles. They planned to flood the skies over West Germany with so much flak and so many SAMs that NATO air power would be ground into dust. But the events of June 1982 proved that the missile shield was made of paper. If the Israelis could dismantle the most advanced Soviet defense network in 2 hours using American export technology, what would the United States Air Force do to the Red Army in a real war? The answer was terrifyingly clear. The United States would blind them, deafen them, and then destroy them at will. The thousands of tanks parked in East Germany, the millions of soldiers preparing to rush the Fulda Gap, they were all obsolete. They were just targets waiting for a laser-guided bomb. This realization sent a shockwave through the Eastern Bloc that cracked the foundation of the Iron Curtain. In the months following the Bekaa Valley disaster, a quiet panic spread through the Warsaw Pact leadership. Polish and Czech generals, who had access to the classified reports, began to question the guarantee of Soviet protection. They realized that if war came, they wouldn't be fighting a battle, they would be participating in a massacre. The macro theme of this failure was not military, it was economic and cultural. The Soviet Union had spent the 20th century obsessed with the Second Industrial Revolution, steel, coal, heavy machinery and massive engines. They were masters of the physical world. They could build a tank that could drive through a brick wall. They could build a rocket that could lift a house into orbit. But the war in Lebanon proved that the world had moved on to the Third Industrial Revolution, the revolution of information. The American dominance wasn't based on horsepower, it was based on computing power. The F-15 Eagle didn't win because it had a bigger engine, though it did. It won because it had a microchip that could process radar returns 50 times faster than the vacuum tubes in the MiG-25 aircraft. The Soviets tried to copy it. They launched a desperate espionage campaign to steal Western computer technology. They managed to clone the IBM 360 mainframe. They tried to reverse engineer the Intel processors. But they discovered a hard truth. You cannot steal a culture. The American system worked because it was flexible. It empowered the individual pilot with data. It encouraged innovation and rapid adaptation. The Soviet system was rigid, centralized, and terrified of information flow. A Soviet radar operator wasn't allowed to make a decision without an order from a general. An American pilot could change the entire battle plan based on what he saw on his digital display. The gap wasn't just in the silicon, it was in the soul of the system. The Bekaa Valley turkey shoot forced the Soviet Union into a technological arms race it could not afford to win. To catch up with the Americans, they needed to rebuild their entire electronics industry from scratch. They needed billions of rubles they didn't have. They needed computers they couldn't build. This pressure broke the back of the Soviet economy. In a desperate attempt to modernize, Mikhail Gorbachev launched perestroika just a few years later. He tried to open up the economy to save the military. But it was too late. The rot was too deep. In many ways, the road to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 began in the skies over Lebanon in 1982. And the legacy of that mystery? We saw it again, almost exactly a decade later, during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. When the United States coalition launched the air campaign against Iraq, the world watched in awe as stealth fighters and cruise missiles dismantled the Iraqi air defense network in the first night. The media called it Star Wars. They called it a new kind of war. But for the old Soviet generals watching CNN in their retirement dachas, it wasn't new. They had seen it before. They had seen the dress rehearsal in the Bekaa Valley. They knew that the fourth largest army in the world in Iraq, equipped with Soviet T-72 tanks and MiG-29 aircraft, was going to be annihilated. They knew that the era of the tank and the unguided rocket was over. The era of the microchip had arrived. Epilogue. Today, the Bekaa Valley is quiet. The vineyards have returned. The wreckage of the SA-6 batteries has long been cleared away, sold for scrap, or buried under the drifting dust. Tourists visiting the ancient ruins of Baalbek rarely look up at the sky. They don't hear the phantom echoes of the jet engines or the scream of the jamming pods. But this narrow strip of land is hallowed ground in the history of warfare. It is the graveyard of the Soviet superpower. It is the place where the Russian bear, terrifying and immense, reached out its claws to strike, only to find that it was fighting a ghost. The mystery of June 1982 was solved, but the lesson remains. In the modern world, power is not measured in the weight of your armor, but in the clarity of your vision. The Soviets were strong, but they were blind. And in the unforgiving arena of history, the blind do not survive. This was the moment the Cold War was truly lost. Not at the negotiating table, but on a radar screen that showed nothing but white noise.